In the second part of chapter 26, we're getting into the female reproductive system. We're going to analyze it just like we did the male by looking at the anatomy and also the physiology of the system. We know that there are several similarities between male and female systems: developing the gamete, undergoing meiosis in the organs that are producing the gametes, but the females go a little bit further because they have to support the developing embryo for the weeks of gestation, and they also will have to give birth and then provide nourishment for the growing infant. So of course the genitalia for the female are the ovaries that produce the gametes, the uterine tubes where fertilization should happen, the uterus or the womb where there should be a gestation, and then of course the vagina to receive the sperm for reproduction and also to deliver the baby out of the female's body. We know that within the peritoneum there's the uterus that creates two regions. You have those given respectively, and you can see again from the cadaver, from the human body exhibit, how all the organs are going to have to interplay with one another by using the abdominopelvic cavity. So this view, the mid-sagittal view of the female system, again notice that you have the urethra is the more anterior orifice, the vagina a little bit larger and also in the middle, and then of course the rectum on the posterior side. Of course the urethra, we know from the urinary system, leads up to the urinary bladder, where now we're going to see the vagina leads up to the cervix, then the uterus, and then we'll talk about the uterine tube and the ovary and the makeup anatomically of the female system. So we know the ovaries again are paired female gonads. They're found on the lateral walls of the pelvic cavity, and they're producing every month during the reproductive cycle of the female ova or eggs. Ovum, it would be singular, so if you see any of those, the oocyte is what's ovulated. All of those are talking about the same structure, the egg from the female. We know that the ovaries play a huge role in production of your estradiols, your estrone, all of those estrogen classes, along with progesterone, inhibin, and relaxin. So each one of those will do its job in the reproductive system for the female. We know that as far as the ovary, you have the cortex region where you're undergoing oogenesis. So remember, this is all about starting with the 2N or 46 chromosomes and ending with the process of meiosis to produce the gametes. So within the surface there begins to develop these little follicles that are sac-like structures to hold the gametes. The medulla region is the inner portion of it where blood vessels feed in to the ovary, the lymphatic vessels and the nerves. So it's around this structure where, in the cortex, where ovulation eventually will happen on the surface of the ovary. As far as the ligaments that hold the ovary in place, they're suspended in midair within the abdominopelvic cavity. You have the broad ligament, which is, of course, the largest flat ligament that attaches to the ovary, the uterine tubes, and the uterus, connects each one of those to the pelvic area of your hip bone. The ovarian ligament connects the medial side of it, so you have it attached near the uterine tube. Then you have the suspensory ligament that connects the lateral surface and provides a passageway for the ovarian artery and vein into the ovary. So again, the three ligaments, and I believe in the lab book, I know we labeled the broad ligament and analyzed the structure around the ovary. But again, their purpose is to hold the ovary suspended within the pelvic cavity of the female. The uterine tubes, also known as fallopian tubes, also known as oviduct, so any term there, are the initial part of the reproductive system because the oocytes have to move through the uterine tubes toward the uterus. We know also that the uterine tube is the site of fertilization. Those first couple of hours, the first couple of days of development of the embryo, it all occurs within the uterine tubes or fallopian tubes. There are 4 different regions to it, and in lab you've labeled from the ovary toward the uterus, you have the fimbriae, and we'll talk about the importance of those to create that movement so that the follicle that ovulates will draw the egg into the female's uterine tube. The infundibulum, you have that area that's at the distal end. Then the ampulla, and we'll see the importance of the ampulla where fertilization usually takes place, the union of the egg and the gamete. And then where the uterine tube attaches to the fundic region of the uterus would be the isthmus. So those 4 areas from the distal opening there at the ovary to where it attaches to the uterus. As far as ovulation, we know that the oocyte is suspended in meiosis 1, and on day 14 it would leave the mature follicle by a process known as ovulation. So as ovulation occurs, we know that the antrum around that mature follicle, or in that mature follicle and around the egg, is going to push the oocyte off the surface of the ovary. So the fimbriae in the uterine tubes will begin to move and create a current that directs that oocyte into the uterine tube. Does it always happen? No. We know that ectopic pregnancies happen where it doesn't wind up in the tube, but it attaches to the uterine, outside of the uterine tube, or sometimes it'll fall into the pelvic cavity and attach to the urinary bladder. There's complications that can result. But the uterine tubes do have smooth muscle within their walls and create this peristaltic contraction or waves, again, to create a current. Also, you have the lining of it with ciliated cells that as the cilia begin to move in unison, the oocyte is drawn from the fimbriae to the ampulla, and then the infundibulum, and then finally the isthmus before it actually falls into the uterus for implantation. The cells that are non-ciliated are going to create a mucus-like secretion. This helps keep the oocyte moist and help keep it nourished from desiccation or drying out. We know that the fertilization begins as the cell from the sperm binds to and penetrates the oocyte's membrane, and we said this is going to occur in the ampulla. So fertilization typically occurs within the ampulla region of the uterine tube. As far as the uterus or the womb, we know that the sperm go up through this area to enter into the uterine tubes, but it also is going to provide the major site for implantation to occur so that that fertilized ovum can be protected, it can be nourished, and it can develop in this organ. It is a pear-shaped organ, so it's hollow on the inside, in the pelvis, anterior to the rectum, and posterior to the urinary bladder. We know that it has 3 regions. The dome-shaped structure, of course, is the fundus, where the uterine tubes come into the uterus. The body is the main region, and then the inferior neck of it is known as the cervix. So we know the wall of it has 3 different layers. Each one of those have their own histology, and we know the inner layer is what's shed during the menstrual flow phase of the menstrual cycle. So you have the perimetrium, which is the outermost serous layer, that's an extension of the parietal peritoneum. The myometrium, which is smooth muscle that will contract during not only orgasm but also for childbirth to happen. And then the endometrium that lines the uterine cavity has simple columnar epithelium. This is a mucous membrane that will rest on a thin layer of connective tissue that's called the lamina propria. And we'll talk about the 2 parts to the endometrium in 1 second. The vagina, of course, is the organ for copulation, so it's designed naturally to allow the insertion of the penis so that the sperm can find its way to the egg that is waiting to be fertilized. So it's there to receive the penis during sexual intercourse, but also a passageway for giving birth and for the menstrual flow to be released from the female's body. We know that it extends down from the cervix exterior to the body. It does parallel the urethra that lies directly in front of it, and the rectum that lies directly posterior behind it. The wall is composed of transverse ridges called rugae, just like we saw the extensions of those off the stomach wall the vaginal wall also has this that will help stimulate the penis for climax during intercourse. The mucosa layer is stratified squamous epithelium in the adult vagina, and it's able, of course, for sexual reproduction and the frictional forces that are associated with it to occur. The cervix also will provide some lubrication, especially during orgasm of the female. There's epithelial cells within its lining that secrete glycogen, so that, of course, is going to be metabolized by the bacteria. It creates a lactic acid buildup within the vaginal wall and the vagina itself, and it creates the acidic pH of this region. We know covering over a very vascular partition of mucosa on the distal vaginal orifice, you have the hymen. So, of course, during first sexual intercourse also, sometimes it's very active, sports-minded females, that there's any type of trauma on several occasions could disrupt the hymen, not necessarily first sexual intercourse. That has a sociological connection, because a lot of, even today in modern society, in some parts of the world, if it is ruptured, they consider the female not to be a virgin, and many times she's either killed or sold off as a slave. So anyway, the anatomy of it does still have sociological ramifications. We know the external reproductive structures of the female are known as the vulva. So we have the mons pubis, that's usually where the outgrowth of pubic hair is, a mound of tissue that's there. The pubic bones that lie on each side, notice at the apex of the vulva, that's where the pubic symphysis is. Of course, the clitoris coming toward the vagina. You have the urethral orifice. Then, of course, the openings of the vaginal orifice, and on each side you have vestibular glands. Then, of course, the anus toward the posterior side. So we know that the peritoneum is around that area, and it's composed of the labia majora and the labia minora. And, of course, you have the derivations of that, the derivatives, in your lab book, but the textbook calls it the labia majora and labia minora. So your textbook also does a good job with describing the internal and external genitalia in one succinct chart, so you can go back over that to look at function versus the structure. So in this section we looked at the female reproductive structures, the alternate names for each structure. We also provided functions for each one of those, and again, that chart is a quick reference. We traced the pathway of the gamete from where it was formed in the ovary to where it implants in the uterus, and we talked about the site of fertilization is the ampulla of the uterine tube. So the site of fertilization within the ampulla. The histology of the uterine wall consisting of the parametrium, the myometrium, and endometrium, and then the histology of the vagina.